Chapter 3. With only Yamada by his side now, Reeve kept heading ever deeper into the tower. They were more cautious from that point, checking each new passage whenever they came to a junction. The digital map made automatically by their suit showed that they were now almost a third of the way into the tower, but their route had also taken them almost a quarter of the way around counterclockwise as well. The tunnels had also turned back around at several points, and they'd hit a couple of dead ends, so even though they'd walked almost 1.5 kilometers, they were only about 150 meters from the exterior wall. Tunnel after tunnel, turn after turn, Reeve could feel himself getting wound tighter and tighter. Their communications with the rest of the company were now erratic, fading in and out for no apparent reason. Their last communication from Steiner had been an order for any squads not making progress towards the center to redeploy to support a push through an arterial route that led directly from the main entrance. But that had been a while ago. Reeve could feel himself getting wound tighter and tighter. He actually preferred being in the middle of a battle to this, combing through a structure that seemed to have no logic or comprehensible purpose behind its design. The longer they went without seeing a mantid, the lower his adrenaline levels dropped. Currently, he could feel every ache, pain, and major injury he'd previously been too hyped up to notice. The frustration didn't help. It felt like ages since they'd last seen a mantid. The tunnels just went on and on and on and on. They turned another corner, and suddenly there was no more tunnel. There was just space. For a moment, Reeve thought he had literally somehow ended up in space. He could see nothing but blackness, and in the distance a few blinking lights. However, his armor's cameras were showing something different in the infrared range. There was a wall in the distance. They were in a chamber larger than an aircraft hangar. You could comfortably park 2 jumbo jets wingtip to wingtip and still have room to spare. As far as Reeve could see, the chamber was a sphere, and he and Yamada were standing on a walkway that was maybe 10 meters above the midpoint. As Reeve struggled to take in what he was seeing, he realized that the vast space in front of them wasn't completely empty. There were 4 pylons jutting out of the walls towards the center of the sphere, reaching about 3/4 of the way. They weren't straight, but coiled and curved in ways that made Reeve's eyes water. This must be it. It had to be what they were looking for. What else could it possibly be? Reeve was just about to try to open a comm channel to Steiner when a shutter ran along the wall. Something was happening. At first he couldn't see anything, but then he spotted movement on the other side of the chamber. A circular platform was extending from the wall, wide enough that you could park at least a couple of dozen cars on it, and connected to the wall by a broad walkway. It stopped right in the center of the chamber, and then the 4 pylons began to extend until they were within a couple of meters of the platform. His infrared cameras told him that the pylons were starting to heat up a lot. If there had been atmosphere in the chamber, then Reeve would have been boiled in his suit, but even without heat convection he still felt the warmth coming off the pylons. That was far from the strangest thing that was happening in the chamber, though. In the center, around the platform, there were lights. Reeve was acclimated to the darkness now, and he actually flinched as his eyes were bombarded with flashes. It was like watching glowing soap bubbles swell and burst, with colors mixing and merging until Reeve wasn't sure if he was actually seeing what he was seeing or just having a stroke. The cameras on his suit showed emissions off into not just the infrared but the ultraviolet as well. Then his radiation alarm went off. A second later there was a flash so blinding his visor automatically went opaque. His cameras were out for a moment as well, but fortunately the rest of his systems were intact. The visor became transparent again a moment later. The light show had stopped. Reeve checked his radiation monitor. Fortunately, it had been a low dose, only about a dozen X-rays worth. Then he looked back towards the center of the chamber. Standing on the platform, lit by the lights on their armor, were 100 or so mantid soldiers. Reeve just caught the faint blue shimmer as they activated their shields. A door opened where the walkway connecting to the platform met the wall. In lockstep, the fresh, mantid infantry marched out to join the battle. They had found the teleporter. Up until a year ago, everyone had believed that the mantids were limited to slower that light travel. The mantid ships that originally attacked Earth had been tracked as they approached the planet, slowing down from about 80% light speed. There were 16 of them, and in all the years since then, there had never been more than 16. After the first mantid ship was brought down over London, the scientists who examined it hadn't found any sign of any kind of propulsion system that wasn't just a more advanced version of what they already knew. After London, The Mantids had been more circumspect in their raids, and for years afterwards, they'd avoided taking any significant risks. Even then, they'd lost two more, one as it was hovering over Cairo, and one just as it was entering the atmosphere over the Atlantic. 14 years after the first Mantid contact, Earth intelligence was sure that the Mantids now had only 13 ships at their disposal. It could even identify each one by subtle differences in their configuration and hull erosion. For a while, Earth was almost a Mantid-free zone, as new weaponry made it more and more dangerous to come anywhere near the planet. And then they raided the new United Military Orbital Station with 14 ships. A few weeks later, they turned up again with 16, then 18. It had taken the combined intelligence agencies of Earth a long time to work out a theory for where all the Mantid ships kept coming from, and explain how they were able to deploy ground forces in much greater numbers than they'd ever risked before, even back at the start when their technological advantage made them virtually invulnerable. It had been known for some time that the Mantids retreated to lunar orbit after every raid, easy enough to track their trajectories after they left Earth. Harder, though, to determine what they were doing there. In the early years, there hadn't been any way of sending probes to the moon. A lot of NASA's infrastructure had been destroyed, and when they did manage to launch a rocket, it was picked off easily. Without shields, there wasn't much they could do to protect it. It was only after the first ship was downed over London that scientists were able to really examine Mantid shield technology. It was much more complicated than making the shield-neutralizing anti-field generators. But with a working example in their hands, they were finally able to reverse engineer it. One of the first tests of the new shield prototypes had been to send a probe into lunar orbit. It was eventually caught and destroyed by anti-field weapons, but not before it had transmitted back the first images of the dark side of the moon seen for over a decade. They included the tower. At first, it was believed that it was simply a base. Somewhere the Mantids could store what they took from Earth, make repairs to their equipment, and so on. However, after new ships started appearing, eventually someone offered a more radical explanation: a teleporter. It would certainly explain where the extra ships were coming from. In fact, it was the only explanation. The hull composition of Mantid ships was fairly well understood by that point, and every intelligence agency was sure that they hadn't taken anywhere near enough material from Earth, nor could they get what they needed on the moon. There was still the possibility that they were mining elsewhere in the system, but they'd show no capability for that, and limited manufacturing ability. Why raid Earth for what they could get elsewhere? They'd specifically concentrated on attacking the cities with the most refined metals, sometimes taking entire warehouses but also vehicles, power lines, and even bridges. When the next probe took photos of a section of a spaceship being hauled out of the top of the tower, it proved where the new ships were coming from. There was still a large faction within Earth's scientific community who thought that the Mantids were somehow constructing their ships within the tower, despite the lack of resources to do so. Either way, the consequences were clear. Even as Earth threw all its economic reserves into building a fleet to attack the tower, Mantid ships were gathering in lunar orbit. The newly created Joint Naval Command had hoped that their fleet alone would be enough to destroy the tower. But long-range fire was either intercepted or just bounced harmlessly off the shield. Earth had bought itself breathing space with the construction of the defense satellite grid, but it was clear that it didn't have the ships to take the battle to the Mantid fleet currently gathering around the moon. At least not alone. A combined arms approach had been developed. The fleet would engage the Mantid ships protecting the tower from orbit, keeping them occupied while landing craft delivered an infantry force to the surface. The ground forces would storm the tower and either destroy it outright or bring down the shield, allowing any surviving ships to bombard it from orbit. It had been a Hail Mary play even as originally planned, and no one had expected that they would be met by a Mantid army at least 3 times their size. It was a miracle anyone had made it as far as the tower, let alone managed to fight all the way to the center. During the briefings back in Earth orbit, they'd told Reeve that the primary objective was to destroy the tower outright. If they made it inside and found the structure was weak enough to allow for demolition, then they were to do that, but otherwise they were to look for the shield generators. If they couldn't make it to the shield generators, then they were to do as much damage as possible to whatever was allowing the Mantids to build more ships, whether it was a manufacturing center or a teleporter. Well, Reeve was pretty sure he'd found enough evidence to settle the argument over whether the mantids were manufacturing ship components here or teleporting them in from their home system, and he knew just what to do about it as well. On his back he carried a pack with 4 bricks of plastic explosive, stuff powerful enough to make the old C4 look like party poppers. Very carefully he took them out and inserted the remote detonators. Yamada did the same. It didn't matter that they didn't speak each other's language now. They both knew what the other was thinking. The pylons were arranged so that 2 were accessible from the walkway they were on. 2 would have to be enough. Reeve and Yamada left half their explosives at the base of the nearest pylon, then started heading round the walkway to the one opposite. They'd almost made it when just behind them, a group of mantids spilled out of a side passage onto the walkway. Yamada shoved his remaining bricks into Reeve's arms and drew his sword. He didn't say anything, and he didn't need to. Reeve would have argued, but there was no time. He gave Yamada a nod that he knew the guy understood, then started sprinting for the next pylon. He climbed down onto the pylon and was about to set the explosives like he had at the last one, when a faint vibration passed along it. It was powering up, and it occurred to Reeve that if he wanted to do the most damage, he might be better off putting the explosives right at the tip, right in the middle of whatever the hell those rainbow bubbles were, and maybe close enough to the center to damage the other pylons as well. He looked back up at Yamada. He'd given some ground, but he was still holding his own. The walkway was only wide enough for 2 people to stand side by side, and so far fighting 2-on-1 wasn't enough for the mantids to dislodge him. As Reeve watched, another mantid body slid off the walkway, falling down into the darkness.